One thing that is beneficial about this world system, it brings to surface quickly those who are for the Lord and those who are false. How so, you might think? The world nowadays has so heightened in its wickedness and darkness that those who are elected will truly manifest perseverance and godly devotion. Those who are false will quickly be overcome by the strong, persistent pull of worldly temptation. Be on the lookout and remember what it says in Proverbs 4:18 through 19. The path of the just is like the shining sun that shines even brighter until the perfect day. The way of the wicked is like darkness. They do not know what makes them stumble. Welcome to another episode of His Generation Podcast. You're listening to His Generation Podcast, a weekly exploration into biblical truth as we explore the Word of God. His Generation Podcast airs every Sunday morning, so grab your Bible, and here we go. This Sunday morning, we'll be covering Proverbs chapter 7. This is the last of our three-part series when it comes to the young man and the father's advice when it comes to the sexual behavior and temptation that encompasses the young man as he goes out into this world and navigates the world system to find that perfect mate that God has designed for him. Now in chapter 7, we get more into the weeds when it comes to the adulteress. So it starts there in Proverbs chapter 7 at the very beginning. The father gives instruction to the son. In verse 1 of chapter 7, it says, "My son, keep my words and treasure my commands within you. Keep my commandments and live, and my law as the apple of your eye. Bind them on your fingers and write them on the tablet of your heart. Say to wisdom, you are my sister, and call understanding your nearest kin, that they may keep you from the immoral woman, from the seductress who flatters with her words." And there we see immediately this idea to keep or to guard the words of the father, because they will come into deflecting the words of the seductress who flatters. That's the idea behind it. And before we go into this illustration, I want you to carefully observe the words of the father. We're going to use it to paint this illustration a little bit here of this seductress woman coming to the young man, or in this case, his son. And I believe that they are used intentionally and used in order to connect the discourse to the entire text and to bring in depth to its revelation, or let's just call it its reality of the precepts of God's law. We talked a little bit about that last time. This idea of when it comes to adultery as it is commanded against in the Decalogue or the Ten Commandments. So this is what this illustration is basically going to lead to, that idea of how one is to look at adultery when the temptation is brought forth, and how one is to walk in obedience with knowledge of why not to partake in this very tempting, especially for a young man, this very tempting act of adultery. Let's get into it. Verse 6. "At the window of my house, I looked through the lattice, and I saw among the simple, I perceived among the youths, a man devoid of understanding." And this is that same idea as we saw in chapter 6, verse 32. The person that commits adultery is without understanding. Verse 8, "Passing along the street near her corner, and he took the path to her house in the twilight, in the evening, in the black and dark night." Again, these are just throwback ideas to this idea of this two-path theology. In this case, the path that the young man is taking into his temptation in this illustration that the father's painting is the black and dark night path. So obviously, it's being very poetic in the way of saying that this isn't the right path. This is the wrong path that the young man is taking here. And so we see that very clearly. It goes on to say there, verse 10, "And there a woman met him with the attire of a harlot and hidden motives in her heart." This is part of that two-path theology discussion or that dialect, because we saw there in verse 3 where, again, the father's telling the son to keep his words, to bind them on the tablet of his heart. This allusion to the Old Testament in Exodus when Moses wrote God's commandments on tablets. But this is here the tablet of the woman's heart, which has hidden motives in it. So again, these very unrighteous, sinful attributes are attributed to not only her words, but also to her heart. And that's what the young man needs to consider or have knowledge of when they're going into the situation. Again, going back to this idea of saying, saying to wisdom, you are my sister, and call understanding your nearest kin. So wisdom and understanding are what is needed and what is being given in this illustration of the young man as they are tempted by the harlot. But what we're going to find out as this illustration continues to build with this very colorful, tempting language is that the harlot's more than just a harlot, but she is an adulteress. And according to Proverbs chapter 6, there is a difference. There is a difference between the harlot and the adulteress. So we'll see what the difference in outcomes are when it comes to that. Verse 11, she was loud and rebellious, and her feet would not stay at home. At times she was outside, and at times in the open square, lurking in every corner. So she caught him and kissed him. With an impudent face, she said to him, I have peace offerings with me. Today I have paid my vows. So in a very shameless way, she approaches this young man, and that's the point of the illustration. And the last part there is going to be very helpful to understand the remaining chapters of Proverbs when we start to go into chapters 8 and 9 as we finish this whole dialect of chapters 1 through 9. Because ultimately we're putting into building blocks this idea of wisdom or lady wisdom and folly, or let's say lady folly. Like I said, they're being personified here. So wisdom or lady wisdom is associated with God and the things of God. So for the Jewish mindset, they're thinking the temple, they're thinking a place of worship, they're thinking a place of holiness. That's the idea of God. And so when you say lady wisdom and you compare her to those things, being on a hill, not just being everywhere, but being in a specific spot. Whereas here, lady folly is also like God in a sense, trying to imitate the attributes of God. Thus, in verse 14, she says things that makes her sound like she's a godly person. Like she went to the temple with peace offerings and paid for her vows, right? These are all godly devotions that she is attempting to seduce and be deceptive with this young man to get him into her room. She's playing make-believe, basically. Or, let's say this, a false god. So, Lady Folly is compared to an idol or a false god. That's the idea of the bigger picture of Proverbs chapters 1 through 9. But here we see it start to very much come unpacked or unraveled. It says there, verse 15, so I came out to meet you, diligently to seek your face, and I found you. I have spread my bed with tapestry, colored coverings of Egyptian linen. I have perfumed my bed with myrrh and aloe and cinnamon. Come, let us take our fill of love until the morning. Let us delight ourselves with love. So understand this. This word love is used there very casually. Of course, those that are of the biblical mindset understand that love is more than just a feeling, and in this case, more than just a sexual feeling. And so, again, these words that the woman chooses to entice with her mouth are words of falsity, false hope, false devotion, ultimately false belief system. And they're described here very colorfully in this enticing away to the young man. I want you to remember also too, in regards to this verse right here, Hebrews 13 verse 4, where it says, marriage is honorable among all and the bed undefiled, but fornicators and adulterers God will judge. And so later on, the apostle who wrote the book of Hebrews understood this truth about righteousness, and when it came to the doctrine of marriage, and it's something that's very consistent as you go through the Bible, both Old Testament and New Testament. And in this case, this verse is definitely applicable with its consistency. Verse 19, for my husband is not at home. He has gone on a long journey. He has taken a bag of money with him and will come home on the appointed day. And this is the part where we understand she is not just a harlot, but she is an adulteress. And then the continuation of what the father is saying to the son makes very clear sense. Because as we continue on, you're going to find out that the consequences of the son being tempted in this situation is severe. Let's continue on what it says. With her enticing speech, she caused him to yield, and with her flattering lips, she seduced him. So now guys sometimes can be assertive in the way that they approach girls, but when a girl approaches a guy this assertive and is very attractive and very alluring, in this case here, I would say 9 out of 10 times they're going to fall for it. Whether good intentions from the female person or bad intentions, 9 out of 10 times the guy's going to fall for it. And that's the point of the text. It's something that most guys will encounter in their lifetime at some point. And the mindset of being righteous in the midst of this, how to navigate in the midst of this, is calling wisdom my sister and understanding my kin. And so it makes very practical sense, the advice of the father. Continuing on in verse 22, it says, immediately he went after her as an ox goes to the slaughter. So you're thinking like a sacrificed animal. That's the concept that's being placed here. And also too, because originally she said she went to go pay her vows. So there's also this idea of temple devotion that's going on there. So this could be a play on that words also too, just putting that out there. Or as a fool to the correction stocks, till an arrow struck his liver, as a bird hastens to the snare. He did not know it would cost his life. Proverbs 22:8 says this, thorns and snares are in the way of the perverse. He who guards his soul will be far from them. So the idea in the beginning where the father says, keep my words or guard these words, is this concept that's being in an illustration of a bird being snared in a trap. If you would have kept the words, you wouldn't have been snared in this trap. But once you give into the temptation, it's like that trap where a bird or the prey is helpless. That's the bigger piece that it's being spread here, because it cost you your life. That's severe. It's not like a punishment. I think in chapter 6 where the father said, there's no recompense for you in the husband's eyes. The husband of the adulteress is going to want the least your life as payment for what you did. So when it comes to adultery, it's much more deeper than just someone being tempted by a prostitute and it just costing them something financial. It's much more deeper than that's the father emphasizing this. Because once you get to verse 24, you again get this idea of commands and not just advice. You get a very imperative type of speech. In other words, this you must do type of speech. It says there in verse 24, now therefore listen to me. Again, listening to him, his words compared to the enticing words of the harlot. Now therefore listen to me, my children. Pay attention to the words of my mouth. Do not let your heart turn aside to her ways. Do not stray into her paths. For she has cast down many wounded, and all who were slain by her were strong men. Her house is the way to hell, descending to the chambers of death. There's the severity. So not only a command of you must do this rather than just counsel or advice, but also too this remembrance of the consequences. Hell, the chambers of death. So in other words, a persecution that leads to execution. That's the idea of this poetic, colorful way of saying, do not be tempted by the adulteress for the young man. Makes a lot of sense. And if we really think about it and use these illustrations to paint even more of an illustration in our own mind, we have to see that it's very explicit message when it comes to adultery. The father is serious because he understands that sexual behavior is a strong part of a person and it needs to be given strong direction in its appropriate application. And this is why the father goes to the extreme of comparing adultery to hell, which is the punishment for those who rebel against God, and then mentioning the idea of the execution room, or in this case, the chambers of death. So when I hear these words, I think of execution rooms. You know, like what are some of the qualities of an execution room? I know here in the Western world or in the United States, you've probably seen pictures on TV or maybe pictures from historical records. And you see there in the execution room, you'll have straps and restraints. Also, there'll be viewing options for those who are victims of the crime. And then also, too, you have clocks. They actually document what time the passing and the execution was completed. And you have multiple devices, you have isolation, you have loneliness, etc. It's not a beautiful sight, the execution room. And nor it should be. For the punishment of heinous sin is a heinous execution. That's the idea that's being here. And God will judge those heinous sins. And that's the idea that the father is giving advice to the son for the purpose of survival, a practice of righteousness, and ultimately an appropriate fear of God, of understanding that God's not playing around. God is holy, and we need to keep that in mind to have an appropriate fear. Also, you know, I've given you more of like a modern version of the execution chamber, but also to think of like even some more of our drastic versions of those, even in the Western history, World War II, the concentration camps of the Jewish people by the Nazi Germany. Those are horrible conditions, especially the death chambers or the gas chambers. That too is comparative to someone who is entrapped in the act of adultery. That's the idea behind it. So these are very strong pictures for the son to understand of why not to be given into that temptation and why to resist it instead. However, I want to close with some final words here because sometimes we think, you know, there's almost this equal battle. You know, there's this equal battle when it comes to temptation. You know, Satan and his forces have a heart to control and to go against man and humanity and life-giving quality. And God is the equal of that power that is against us or against humanity. However, you know, when you're developing the idea of good and evil, there are no equal forces, and we need to keep that in remembrance. The devil is not God's equal. However, there is an order to creation, and the wages of sin is death. In other words, sin leads to its end, which is death. And on the way, one discovers the fruit of its wicked consequences, like this young man in adultery. And I believe that the deception of Satan is to make humans think he is equal, and to be equal to a king, you need a kingdom. So in this case, death and hell become his pseudo-kingdom. But this hell is no kingdom. Rather, the scriptures depict it as a punishment and imprisonment. It's a banishment separate from any presence of holiness. It is not ruled by Satan. Rather, it will occupy him and all of God's enemies. But remember, the only sovereignty of Satan, if there is any sovereignty of Satan, is the ability to walk to and from the earth, and leadership over fallen angels, and extreme psychological manipulation over humanity. All other movements and interactions of him first require permission from the true sovereign of humanity and all of creation, the Lord Jesus Christ. So keep that in remembrance. Fight the good fight as you are out there battling temptation. I leave you with that on this Sunday, the Lord's Day. God bless you. Thank you for joining us at His Generation Podcast. To receive more information about the podcast, please visit our website, hisgeneration.net, or check out our YouTube channel,
His Generation podcast for the video format of this broadcast. His Generation is a production of Generation Mars Media, located in Orange County, California.